Hi, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are so excited that you're here and going to spend this next hour or so with us. And my name is Lisa Ellis. I'm an internist here at VCU and the chair of our Wellness Task Force. And I am just delighted to introduce our speaker and presenter here this evening. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit because it's such a great story with Dr. Jagsi. Reshma Jagsi is here today, is the Newman Family Professor and Deputy Chair of Department of Radiation Oncology and the Director of the Center of Bioethics and Social Sciences at the University of Michigan. She's been studying gender equity in academics since she was in her student life at Harvard. And I have to say that it's so cool that she graduated first in her class from Harvard as well. She brings to her research in this area her perspective as a physician and a social scientist to promote evidence-based intervention. She's the author of over 300 articles, including numerous high-impact publications in the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, JAMA. Her research has been funded by multiple independent places and foundations. And most spectacular, I think, this year, with her R01 application to support the Empower trial, which maybe we'll learn something about tonight, in which she's conceived to test intervention to promote gender equity. She received a perfect 10 impact score from the NIH and then was invited to join the NIH's advisory committee to research on women's health, which is quite an amazing accomplishment as well. She has had impact on policies influencing funders and journals to require double binding of reviews, redefining grant selection criteria, and very prominent requiring institutions to submit gender equity report cards, which is fantastic. Accrediting boards to redefine their policies for parental leave, for medical training, and institutions to increase transparency of their policies and compensation and advancement criteria. So her impact has been broadly valued in academic medicine. And even this year alone, she's had 3 perspective essays that have been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. We are so honored to have with us tonight Dr. Jagsi, here virtually to present Professional Equity for Women in Academic Medicine, an evidence-based approach. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. I'm just going to share my screen here and confirm that you guys can see the slides, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, it is such an honor to be here as the Ellis lecturer and very special. So thank you for including me. What I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is review with you some data that my group and others have collected on the nature and causes of gender inequity in academic medicine, and to demonstrate that this is not simply due to a slow pipeline, but rather reflects the differential impact of challenges like unconscious biases, gendered expectations of society, and overt discrimination and harassment, so that we can then turn to evidence-based interventions. So I'll call your attention on this graph, which depicts the representation of women in the medical profession, to a couple of points. First, I want you to look at 1972, which is the year that Title IX was enacted. And as you may know, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 did prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race, but it didn't apply to institutions of higher education. So it wasn't until 1972 and Title IX that medical schools had to stop discriminating against women in admissions, in hiring, and in promotions. And so you see after that there was a dramatic increase in women's participation in the field. And the next time point that I'll call your attention to is over 25 years ago, when we crossed 40%. And at that point, women really were a substantial minority of the medical school class. And then, of course, very recently, we have become 50% of the medical school class. Unfortunately, representation diminishes as we look at more senior ranks, from over 50% of medical school applicants being female to only 18% of department chairs and medical school deans being women. And women are also underrepresented in prominent medical publications. This is one of the first studies that I did in this area, and really documents the truth that women are a very small minority of authors, invited editorialists, or editorial board members of major medical journals. That this was done back when I was a resident, and sadly, it has been replicated a number of times since, continuing to demonstrate really unexpectedly low proportions of women in these highly influential positions. Because as we know, that academic medical publication is how we as a field communicate with one another and how we set the priorities for biomedical research. It's by setting, theme issues when you're an editorial board member, or by writing a prominent editorial that actually changes the way we think about a problem. And so we need a diversity of voices in these positions. We do need to stand up to gender bias and harassment as mechanisms by which gender inequity develops, because this is a matter of professional ethics. And that's true in two ways. So there are deontological arguments, in other words, rights-based arguments that are grounded in the theory of Immanuel Kant, the idea that human beings have a fundamental dignity that merits respect for its own sake, and that in order to demonstrate that dignity, we must have fair equality of opportunity to senior positions in academic medicine. But we also need gender equity for important teleological reasons. Teleological reasons are consequentialist arguments. Teleological arguments include looking at the mission of academic medical centers and saying, look, it's a tripartite mission of research and education and clinical care. So we know from decades of social scientific research that when you bring together individuals with different life experiences and backgrounds and you allow them to interact, collective intelligence is enhanced. And in fact, groups that are diverse outperform homogeneous groups every time. And we also, so if we want to have the best research, we should have diversity. Similarly, for education, I showed you that half of our medical school class is women. How can we inspire them if we don't provide senior female role models for them? And finally, there's some really interesting teleological arguments that pertain to clinical care and clinical outcomes. So the PNAS study here looks at patient-physician gender concordance and actually finds that female heart attack patients who see male physicians have increased mortality compared to female heart attack patients who see female physicians and male heart attack patients who see male or female physicians. And what's really interesting about that study is that it has something to do with the broader environment. So the conclusion is not that women need to see women, but rather that women bring an important perspective to the table for clinical care, because those male physicians who had a higher proportion of female physicians working with them actually had better mortality outcomes for their female patients. And of course, this also affects social behaviors in the operating room. And many of you are aware that when we look at mortality outcomes for hospitalists, we actually see a difference by gender. So maybe we could just wait this out though, right? It hasn't been all that long. Every time I say that, I like gulp and I try to get rid of the slide. And every time I get rid of the slide, the first question from the audience is, but it hasn't been that long. Can we wait this out? So I keep putting the slide back in. Should we just be patient? I will be patient. By the end of my career, I will be able to get rid of this slide. Lynn Nonamaker actually did the best study looking at this, because the best way to look at this is not a cross-sectional study like I showed you from the AAMC or the authorship study that I showed you, but rather to look at cohorts over time. And so what Nonamaker did was she looked at 15 cohorts who graduated medical school from 1979 to 1993 and found that the proportion of women who advanced to the rank of associate professor were significantly lower than expected in all but 2 of the cohorts she studied. And even the women who reached the rank of associate professor were less likely to become full professors than their male counterparts. Now, there are a number of criticisms of this study, one of which could be that 1979 to 1993 was a long time ago. And you saw on that graph that that was before women hit 40%. And so maybe things have changed. Well, we can thank Bapu Jena and his colleagues at Mass General for replicating this finding in more recent doximity data. But sadly, even in more recent cohorts, this continues to be the case. But a more challenging criticism is that a study of this sort is comparing apples and oranges. And the argument goes like this. We inculcate in little girls communal behaviors, taking care of one another. And we inculcate in little boys agentic behaviors, going out there and doing something, intervening. And so it might not be all that surprising if a higher proportion of women decided to go into academic medicine because they wanted to practice clinical care in a team-based environment, and they wanted to educate the next generation of physicians, whereas men might be more likely to go into academic medicine because they wanted to pursue scholarly discovery. And if that's the case, it certainly would have policy implications because, of course, it is strange for us to say we have a tripartite mission, but then when we engage in academic promotions to focus so heavily on one of those three missions, the scholarly mission. But it's a different policy implication than if we actually had any evidence that similarly situated, apt, and motivated men and women were having different outcomes in their careers. And so as I thought about this, as I was a resident, you heard that I was a trainee at Harvard. Larry Summers made some pretty infamous comments right around the time that we had written that New England Journal paper. And it was, it made me think about whether I could actually identify a group of women where Larry Summers himself wouldn't argue they weren't as bright or as interested in research as the men. And that's how I came in my career to study a very interesting population, and that is recipients of prestigious K-Series career development awards from the NIH. And I chose specifically to look at K08s and K23s because those were made to individuals with clinical doctorates, the vast majority of whom are physicians, but there's some vets and dentists and others mixed in. And because there is a really clearly articulated endpoint of the program. So this is a program that is incredibly competitive. It's highly selective. People are in their 30s when they get these grants. They're mature adults. They articulate that they want to become independent investigators. The purpose of the K-Award program is to provide them with societal resources to protect their time, to ensure that they have a dedicated training plan and mentorship necessary to become independent investigators. And although not the only kind of independent award given out by the NIH, the most common independent award given out by the NIH is the R01 grant. And so what I decided to do was look at whether K awardees were going on to get R01 grants at the same rate, regardless of whether they were men or women. And I said to the residents, and I don't usually say this in my talks, but I said to the residents before this, that a lot of my career has come through serendipity and not necessarily thinking I was going to find what I did find. So I will admit that what I thought I was going to find is that if you've actually found a really homogeneous group of individuals, you probably wouldn't see a difference. But then that would target us on the need to address the fact that we don't value education and clinical care, where women are, as Julia Files and colleagues have shown, overrepresented on those tracks. However, here's what I did find. So I'm an oncologist, and so the world turns into actuarial survival curves for me. And it turns out to be a very good way of looking at these data. Because if you don't get an R01 award, within 5 to 7 years, you're probably going to have a really hard time getting one, because your K award's only 5 years long, and your institution's only going to bridge you and protect your time for a couple of more years. And then it's going to get harder and harder to write the grant that hits for an R01. And so it doesn't bode well for your survival in academic medicine as a physician scientist if you don't convert to that R01 relatively soon. And as you can see here, those curves separate like I have a wonderful treatment. And no, I have not decided that the intervention is to administer a Y chromosome, but stay tuned as to the interventions. What we found here is that gender was independently significant as a predictor of R01 attainment on a multivariable analysis in which we controlled for everything we could in the data set we had. So what we used here was the NIH CRISP system, which predated Reporter. It was the publicly available data. So we had the full universe of K awardees. But we only had certain information. So we controlled for the K award type, because we know that 08s are basic science and 23s are patient-oriented research. We controlled for the year of the award because we knew, and by the way, those are gender difference, right? So men are more likely to have 08s, women are more likely to have 23s. We controlled for the year of the award because women were more well represented in the later years of K awardees, and the funding environment got more difficult over time during this time period. So that might have explained some of it. We control for funding institute because women tend to apply to institutes that are less well funded overall. So things like aging, mental health, child health, whereas men tend to apply to things like NHLBI and NCI, and we fund heart, lung, blood, and cancer better as a society. We control for institution because women were overrepresented at the institutions that were in the lowest tier for overall extramural funding, meaning that maybe women had less access to grants administrators or prior successful proposals, or just were rated as having a less good environment for success of their work. And we also controlled for specialty. But again, gender was independently significant after controlling for all of that. So then we use this as preliminary data to conduct a survey study. And we surveyed 800 physician K awardees from 2000 to 2003 who got their new awards from 2000 to 2003. And we surveyed them in 2010. And we asked them about a number of factors. And again, just to you know, as a little bit of inspiration for the residents and the students in the audience, this is the second paper out of this data set. Usually the JAMA paper is the first paper you write. It isn't if you don't think you're going to actually find what you found. The first paper was actually a descriptive paper that went into academic medicine about sort of how these K awardees did. We had an over 70% response rate. It was a nice generalizable sample, and we were able to show what happened in the careers of men versus women. Then I thought, well, you know, there've been a lot of studies actually that have shown that men and women have different compensation. But a lot of those studies really didn't even have access to some very basic factors, including many of these studies didn't even have specialty. And if you don't control for specialty, you know, I could explain away a lot of the gender difference in compensation with specialty, I bet. And actually my hypothesis was that we would explain away most of the gender difference with specialty, and very little with all these other factors that people suggest might explain or even perhaps justify gender differences in compensation. And so I decided to look at that, and I thought that the punchline for this would be quite unpopular in my field of radiation oncology, which is a high-paying specialty. But the punchline was going to be that it's curious that we pay a radiation oncologist a lot more to provide a targeted treatment to a tumor that has already developed than we do, and whether or not that radiation oncologist saves the patient's life, by the way, right? Than we do to the primary care doctor who convinces the patient to stop smoking and not only saves them from developing the lung cancer, but also from heart disease and all the other horrible things that smoking does to them. And they spend countless evaluation and management services and visits, you know, getting them to do the hard work of quitting smoking and staying as non-smokers. It's curious that we don't reward that, right? And that's a communal behavior there, right? We reward the agentic interventional behavior. That was what I thought I was going to find. So I was right. I was part right in that the gender difference in compensation was $30,000, and it was cut in half. The men were making about $200,000 a year. The women were making $168,000. It was cut in half by controlling for specialty alone. When we added in all of those other variables, there was still a $12,000 a year unexplained difference in compensation. So let's just look at this more deeply. So what drives these differences? Well, I mentioned specialty choice. It's important to recognize that choice is in quotation marks because it's not a freely willed choice. Women may be encouraged to occupy lower paid specialties, and specialties chosen by women may pay less, partly because they're predominated by women or involve those less valued feminine behaviors of communal evaluation and management that I just mentioned. There are also differences in productivity, hours, and willingness to change institutions. But again, willingness is in quotation marks because, of course, we all function within the constraints of a gender-structured society, wherein it is typically expected that a woman will marry a man. And no, I'm not saying that a woman must marry a man or that all women marry men. I am saying that it is expected that a woman marries a man, and that it's expected that a woman marries that man who is at or above her age and at or above her educational status. And what that leads to is a lot of situations in which a woman is partnered with someone who is slightly older than her, slightly ahead of her in career. And so even in two physician couples, we'll see the woman turn into the trailing spouse. And once that happens, there start to be more and more pronounced differences in careers. And at some point, it becomes very hard to threaten to leave to pursue a job offer elsewhere when everybody knows that your husband is happy and well employed locally. And so it becomes harder to leverage a retention offer for a woman within those constraints. And in this sample, over 90% of the women had full-time employed spouses. Over half the men had part-time or non-working spouses. There are differences in rank and leadership, but it's important to note that when we're talking about mechanisms here, these are not necessarily justifications. So we adjusted for rank differences in rank and leadership, but let's say that we want to say that, well, John is division chief and Jane isn't, and that justifies paying John more than Jane. Well, that requires then an unbiased process of selecting the division chief, because otherwise it's a double whammy for Jane, because not only does she not get to lead and be the division chief, but she also gets paid less, right? If it was that the department chair just kind of thought about who he, and as I said, 82% of them are who he played golf with last weekend, that's problematic. But a substantial unexplained gender difference remained even after we accounted for all these factors and more. So it's important to note that if anything, we're underestimating the unjustified difference when we talk about the unexplained difference. And yet there's still this substantial difference. So what explains it? Maybe there's gender differences in values or behavior of the employees. Maybe mothers are more likely to sacrifice pay for unobserved job characteristics such as flexibility, and fathers are trying to earn more to support their families. This is certainly something that other studies have shown, so it is part of the explanation, but not here, because we have physician researchers with a relatively homogeneous job type, and actually we didn't see any interaction between gender and parental status, meaning that even the women without children in our study had lower pay than men. And this has been demonstrated again in a health affairs paper just this year by Losasso and colleagues. Losasso actually gave a quote, I think it was to the Wall Street Journal, it was to some major media outlet when this paper came out, and said it must be something they didn't measure relating to family flexibility and the preferences of men versus women and the greater priority that women place on that. And so he actually led a really interesting study with data from first-year physicians in New York State, and actually accounted for preferences for family flexibility, and actually had almost identical findings to ours. Specialty explained half of the difference, and the preferences for family flexibility explained none of it. Another potential explanation is that women don't ask. So as I was telling your residents, Women Don't Ask is a book by Babcock and Lashover, who actually wrote a book also before that one titled, Women Don't Ask is a book by Babcock and Lashover. They also wrote a book after that one called Ask For It, which is the one that I recommended to your residents, and to any other trainees on the call. I do recommend it. It's good for men and women. What it really does is Women Don't Ask details the abundant literature that shows that men and women don't negotiate the same way, and they really can't, because women get penalized if they behave the same way as men. But Ask For It demonstrates the approach of principled negotiation that was initially written about in Getting to Yes, but really takes a gender lens to it and says, but women can't necessarily do all the same things that men can. And so it goes through specifically language and behaviors that women can engage in. And again, men can engage in them too. So I would recommend that if you don't already have it on the bookshelf, and I suspect you do, that you get it for your trainees. There also are potentially differences in employer behavior towards men and women. There is a phenomenon of statistical discrimination whereby employers make inferences based on group characteristics rather than individual characteristics when they set salaries. And there is the thorny notion of the family wage that just won't die. That is this idea that we have a single male breadwinner who is responsible for supporting a family at home, and that we need to pay him to support that family at home. And unfortunately, it is the way that well-meaning leaders make mistakes. I myself almost fell into this myself. This is not by the way, men oppress women intentionally, or men are the only ones who get it wrong. Women get it wrong all the time. I get it wrong all the time, and I study this stuff. The family wage is a really hard construct to erase from our memories. And it's very hard not to feel sorry for someone when you know that they need the money for a particular reason at home. On the other hand, it's also important to compensate people for what they're performing at work rather than what they need at home. We have also deeply ingrained unconscious biases that all of us hold. And this is, again, men and women alike. There's a National Academies report that detailed the impressive body of controlled experimental studies and examination of decision-making processes in real life that show that on the average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications, less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments, and when information is scarce, far more often give the benefit of the doubt to a man than a woman. So the classic study design here is the seminal study by Stein Price and colleagues, who were academic psychologists, who reached out to their colleagues and said, you know how we do these studies. I'm sending you a sham CV. It's not a real CV. You're getting this one CV. We want you to look at it, and we want you to tell us, would you hire this person, and could you rate them for their merit? Tell us about their teaching, their service, and their scholarship. And, we're just trying to understand what is valued in academic psychology these days. And so their colleagues all responded. Each individual subject only got one CV, but half the subjects got the CV titled Brian Miller, and the other half got a CV, the same CV, titled Karen Miller. Turns out that men and women alike are less likely to hire Karen Miller than Brian Miller, and also give Karen lower ratings in terms of her objective merits in terms of teaching, scholarship, and service. This has been replicated in the setting of academic medicine, in the PNAS study to the bottom left, and in a very important and really heartbreaking twist on this this study design. It turns out that Emily and Greg are indeed more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal, and that Lakeisha and Jamal actually need 9 extra years of experience to get called for job interviews at the same rate as Emily and Greg. So this takes us to the point that we all inhabit multiple identities. And up until this point in my talk, I've been referring to women and men as though there are just 2 categories. And of course, we know that gender is not binary. We also know that individuals are never living single issue lives, as Aubrey Lord advised us. And so the concept of intersectionality is one that was developed by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the fact that you can't just add up the experiences of being a woman to being a Black person and expect to understand the experiences of being a Black woman. That there is an intersection of those identities that requires dedicated study in order to understand. And of course, you can see here on this slide the many identities that we all inhabit. And this is something that we absolutely must keep in mind. And unfortunately, until very, very recently, the only data that we could get were of binary gender that we sometimes attributed based on first names. But we are moving to better approaches to try to embrace other perspectives and to be more inclusive in our analyses. There have been, as I mentioned, multiple National Academies reports. So I mentioned the one on the left, Beyond Bias and Barriers. That's where that quote came from. That was published in 2006. In 2020, just this year in February, right before the pandemic broke out, so unfortunately it didn't get as much attention as it should have, there's a wonderful consensus study that I commend to you if you haven't read it already, titled Promising Practices for Addressing the Underrepresentation of Women. And so Opening Doors is a really important report. It's important for us to note that seemingly gender neutral norms, practices, and policies can have a disparate negative impact upon women. And these include policies that govern leave from residency training, expectations regarding work hours, and tenure clocks and limits on grant eligibility, because they can force the collision of biological and professional clocks for those who have a limited window of fertility to bear children and lactate. And they can magnify the inequities of a traditional gender division of labor, whereby certain individuals are more likely to need to take time off to care for older adults or for children, and who are going to be more likely to be expected to perform domestic labor. One of my favorite studies ever. So this was my first R01, most meta R01 ever. It is an R01 on R01 attainment. And what we looked at was how K awardees were spending their time. And so this is another survey study. This is not that sample I showed you before in the JAMA paper that was 2000 to 2003. This is a sample from who got their new K awards from 2006 to 2009. So it is the most meta study ever because it's around the time that I should have gotten a K award if I had gotten a K award. So this is a Generation X population of individuals. And I can tell you as an Xer, we were a generation that grew up with relatively egalitarian expectations. A lot of us had mothers who worked outside the home, or at least had friends whose mothers worked outside the home. And really, we weren't expecting for there to be an ongoing gender division of labor when we grew up. Nevertheless, in this population of high achieving K award recipients, we found that that last bar is what differs the most. And you can see that's domestic labor. That is parenting and domestic tasks. And even after we adjusted for many other factors, including spousal employment status, which remember I said is very different for the men and the women, women were spending 8.5 more hours per week on domestic activities. Now just think, if you could give these women 8.5 extra hours per week, like how many extra scholarly papers would have been written? In my favorite question of my favorite paper, we asked in the subgroup of individuals who had spouses or domestic partners employed full-time, we asked, what happens when your usual childcare arrangements are disrupted? Now, this of course resonates in the pandemic. This is well pre-pandemic, right? We were thinking about snow days, your nanny's sick and can't come in, your kid is sick and can't go to daycare, yada, yada. 43% of the women said, I take care of it myself. The choices were, I take care of it myself, my spouse or partner takes care of it, we split it evenly, we have someone else we turn to. 43% of the women said, I take care of it myself, 12% of the men did. Now, these are issues that have real consequences. And I don't know if you can hear the piano playing in my background, but there is no small irony to the fact that I am giving this talk and my child has just started playing the piano in the background when I gave that slide. This can lead to burnout. So there have been a lot of studies of burnout. We know there is an epidemic of burnout in the physician workforce. And you can measure it in a variety of different ways. You can measure it as a continuous endpoint. You can dichotomize it. You can measure it with mass law. You can measure it with Copenhagen. You can measure it with other burnout inventories. In our study, we found that 40% of women and 30% of men were burned out. And if you measure it the way we do, this is not remarkably different. What we did find is that because this was a longitudinal study, we were able to look at the drivers of the burnout. What were the mechanisms? And in fact, the gender difference in burnout was explained away entirely by those two factors there. The time pressures that I just told you about, parenting, time spent in parenting and domestic tasks. And the second thing was perceptions of work climate. So why might women perceive a more negative work climate? Well, we have this iceberg of sexual harassment that has been described by my colleague Lilia Cortina and widely disseminated by the National Academies in their 2018 landmark report on sexual harassment. And the reason an iceberg is a really nice way of conceiving the problem is that people tend to focus on the tip of an iceberg. But of course, the base is much, much larger. And of course, the behaviors that are down there are the much more prevalent behaviors. And what the organizational psychology literature has shown is that actually those behaviors beneath the surface can be equally detrimental to the endpoints we care about, including physical well-being, mental health, and professional well-being, including attrition from the field altogether, tardiness, and other endpoints that matter. So we absolutely need to address this iceberg of sexual harassment, even though we tend to think of only the egregious tip sometimes when we think of the word. We conducted a study with that same K awardee cohort of Generation Xers and asked them about their experiences of sexual harassment, specifically unwanted sexual comments, attention, or advances by a superior or colleague. And we asked it that way because that's the way it was asked in the last big faculty study that had been done, which had been done back in 1995. And in 1995, 52% of women in a cross-sectional faculty study, many of whom had gone to medical school in the 80s or even the 70s when women were a small proportion of the medical school class, 52% had experienced sexual harassment with that definition. I thought, well, we'll get some better news because things should be better now. we didn't get as much better news as we had hoped. And this may not seem that striking now, but it was actually quite newsworthy on May 17th of 2016 when it was published, because that was before the last presidential election. That was before the Me Too movement. And to see that 30% of these high achieving physician researchers were describing these experiences was actually quite jaw-dropping. And these were not minor incidents, right? Nearly 60% perceived a negative effect on confidence in themselves as professionals, and nearly half reported that these experiences negatively affected their career advancement. So when we published this, I got an outpouring of emails, and I want to read you just part of one with permission. So this is someone who talks about wondering if something was pathologically wrong with her, that she invited that kind of behavior. Was it because I wasn't smart enough? Was it because I was soft-spoken? Was it because there was something so wrong with me I couldn't even recognize it? I read your article with a mixture of simultaneous dismay and relief. Relief because if they've gone through similar things, then maybe I'm not defective. I don't think I can ever talk about my experiences, partially because of fear, partially because it seems ungrateful to do so. There's so much here, right? And it's so important because numbers don't change mind. Stories change minds, right? And so that's what I said to the person who sent me this email. And the whole thing of if they've gone through similar things, maybe I'm not defective. That's the power of the Me Too movement, right? And so I said, it'd be great if you would share this. There's, JAMA has a Piece of My Mind section, and you're such an eloquent writer. And she emailed me back immediately and said, thanks, but no thanks, because I don't want to be labeled a victim. I've spent a long time building up my professional identity. I don't want to be marginalized, stigmatized, retaliated against. If this could help other people, please, by all means, feel free to share that. But I don't want to write about it. So I ended up writing about her story. And when the editor received it, she wrote back to me. I shared her story, other stories, other experiences. And she wrote back and she said, this is great. You just need to add your story and it's done. And I stopped and I said, oh, no, I study this. See, I'm a scholar. I do research. I study this. I'm not a victim. I mean, victims get marginalized, stigmatized. And I'm using the word victim deliberately here. Of course, we're supposed to call individuals targets, but what I was thinking, I don't want to label myself a victim. And then I realized, of course, that that's the whole point, is that my own experience. I also said to her, my experience turned out okay, right? Some creepy guy hit on me at a meeting and a senior female ally came and rescued me. And so nothing bad happened to me. And I don't want to demean the things that have happened to other people by talking about my experience, right? And in the end, I realized that if we don't all share our stories, then women like the one who bravely shared her story with me and allowed me to share it with everyone else will feel that maybe they were defective rather than simply unlucky not to have the senior female ally walk by at the right time. And so we have much that we need to do. And fortunately, we have much evidence to guide us. So from those decades of social scientific research, we actually know what to do. And the National Academy's report showed us that we are the worst field. Women in academic medicine are the most likely to be targeted. Female medical students were 220% more likely than students in non-STEM disciplines to experience sexual harassment. 220%, right? And more likely than students in other STEM disciplines. So we need to gather data to improve our understanding, especially for women in underrepresented or otherwise vulnerable groups, because those groups have been understudied to date. We need to inform interventions, and we need to demonstrate the commitment of organizations, because it turns out that the lowest rates of sexual harassment occur in organizations that are perceived by their employees not to tolerate that behavior. We need to facilitate reporting, offer choices of a variety of complaint handlers, diverse in every way in terms of seniority, in terms of position in the organization, in terms of gender, in terms of anything that you can imagine, anonymous and confidential reporting systems. We need to clarify our policies, and we have to address harassment by patients and families. And I often hear, well, but patients and families, like so much of this is coming from outside our profession, right? What can we do about patients and families? I mean, this is not the profession's responsibility. I will remind us that we are very fortunate to be in a powerful profession that has had outsized influence on society for a long time. And if we set standards in our workplace, they may actually shift societal norms. So in fact, we need to do things like the University of Michigan has done and create patient rights and responsibilities documents that outline what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is. in the end, the causal mechanisms that lead to gender inequity that I've discussed, unconscious bias, harassment, gender division of domestic labor, those causal mechanisms lead to gender inequity, but the causal pathway is bidirectional, because gender inequity itself is the environment within which those other behaviors thrive. And so what we have to actually do is look at the water, right? Why does the iceberg form in the first place? And you can see here all of those factors that we have discussed throughout the talk. And so we have to target these factors, and we have to change the structures that support harassment by employing more women, promoting more women, and integrating more women into every level of the organization. So we end up with a well-integrated, structurally egalitarian workplace in which women and men equally share in power and authority. If we don't inflect that curve, we will find that the current class of medical students, who I told you are already over 50% female, will have retired before we reach parity in the senior most positions of our field. I want to emphasize that we shouldn't be focused on individual fixes. We're not fixing women here, we're fixing systems. We need to have recognition and changes at the institutional level, including mentorship and sponsorship programs. No, this is not go find yourself a mentor. This is, we need programs that actually lead to recognition, so that individuals who are providing mentorship are provided protected time and effort for the work that they are doing. We need to structure these mentorship teams as networks, because that's more efficient and it's also safer. We need to train mentors to be sponsors when they can be sponsors. In other words, put a little bit of their reputation on the line to make opportunities available to their proteges, which is something that the business literature and now the medical literature, including this study here that we led, has shown is more common for men than it is for women. We need to implement evidence-based implicit bias training, and Molly Carnes has led some amazing work at the University of Wisconsin in academic medicine. We need cultural transformation initiatives that I'll be happy to talk more about in question and answer, and we need transparent, consistent, criterion-based evaluation, promotion, and compensation processes, so we don't end up just picking endowed chairs by thinking of who comes to mind. When we think about ways to address the target the mechanisms that we've identified, we also need to promote work-life integration. There are a variety of creative ways to do this, and never has this been more salient than in an era where the pandemic has given us a window into people's home lives, right? There are Distinguished Scholar Awards, which are creative mechanisms for providing helping hands in the workplace. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation has created a nationwide program modeled on a program at Mass General Hospital that I wrote about when I was a resident, and it is extremely exciting to see creative initiatives like that take off. When we get back to attending meetings in person again, we need on-site childcare at conferences, lactation rooms, and facilitated use of funds to support travel-related dependent care expenses. This is actually permitted by federal law on federal grants. It's just that until that paper came out, led by colleagues at UCSF, until that paper came out, there was not a single institution that actually had a way for women or men who wanted to use the funds in that way to do so. Right before the paper came out, the UC system actually changed their policy. Again, it was led by UC authors. And there are creative policies like time banking initiatives. So the folks at Stanford have come up with a pilot where work that is often unrecognized. And of course, in the era of COVID, this is so important, right? The unrecognized work of serving on that committee that isn't really a powerful committee or an important committee that gets you anywhere, but it's a committee that really is important to getting the work of the institution done, or mentoring someone, or teaching, or the things that many people do with absolutely no compensation. This is a way of recognizing that and saying, we're going to give you points, and you can use those points to redeem for whatever it is you need, whether it's grant writing support in the workplace or food delivery service at home. I mentioned to your residents that I have this slide in here to suggest that we are making progress. In 2007, when we wrote this first perspective on parental leave from graduate medical education, we were very circumspect in what we said, but did push. And by 2019, we were able to come out and really call for a minimum of 6 weeks of paid leave for all GME trainees, with an intent to move towards 12 weeks. And just this past February, I was able to speak at a meeting of ACGME and ABMS on this subject. And of course, this summer, we heard that there will be support for doing this from the ABMS. we have a really unique opportunity via social media to connect with one another and to promote equity. Individuals who once felt like the only are no longer alone thanks to social media. And there are many groups, including the over 70,000 member Physician Moms group, and many, many other online groups that allow safe spaces for people to connect over shared experiences and realize that they're not crazy when they feel like they got introduced by their first name yet again at grand rounds. And no, I didn't. Dr. Ellis did call me Dr. Jagsi, but it often happens. And you think, is it just me? Is it just that it's too hard to add doctor before a really complicated name? Gosh, it seems like but I'm on a panel and it's really Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, and Reshma. And of course, Twitter is a really wonderful way that a lot of this research is being disseminated and shared. And if you'd like to follow me at Reshma Jagsi, I do try to tweet out studies that come to my attention in this space. COVID is, of course, amplifying all of these baseline challenges. When I said this back in March, I actually wrote a perspective piece, and the response was, we're not really sure, like the pandemic's actually killing men more than it's killing women. Not really sure that this is the time to really focus on gender equity. Are you really sure this is going to actually have anything to do with gender equity? Maybe we should just focus on the urgent issue at hand. So I thought, well, let me get some data then. And where could we get data on this? Well, we could look at productivity, and there's some anecdotal stuff coming out from, journal editors saying, hey, we're seeing a lot of papers coming in from men, but really not very many from women. Well, papers on COVID-19 would kind of by definition have been written mostly after some of the disruptions or all of the disruptions had occurred. So let's just look at the authorship of the COVID-19 literature and compare it to the literature in those same journals the year before. And what we found was that the proportion of women amongst first authors of the COVID-19 papers was 19% lower than those in those same journals in 2019. So we do inhabit a momentous time in history. We have this tremendous opportunity right now to move from the awareness of the Me Too movement to the action orientation of Time's Up Healthcare. And I'm proud to be a founding member of Time's Up Healthcare, which embraces the principles of dignity, safety, and equity that lead to fair equality of opportunity and equal pay for equal work. And we can apply that familiar healthcare quality improvement framework that we all know so well, whereby we transform structures, processes, and outcomes to the benefit of all of our patients and all of our society, not just our profession alone. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. This is only a subset of my collaborators because the font gets too small, but I want to acknowledge there are many more collaborators than are listed there. My funders and my family, who've been mostly quiet and not walked in at least, although the piano is incredibly distracting and I hope hasn't bothered you. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to questions. I'm going to go turn on the light.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. And boy, just chock full of so many different studies and aspects that we can look at throughout the next few days. I know that we have the chat open so that we can take some questions, and we've got a few minutes for questions if people would like to ask them. And I think that I will start you out with one question if I could. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Jagsi, for this great presentation. This seems to be really hand in hand with wellness. And both of those are really hot topics right now because maybe from COVID, but even prior to that, they are been emerging as something that is really destroying our medical careers in many ways. Affecting our retention, even affecting suicides and things that are very serious in our career. But we see this as a culture change, or we see this as a cross the box off because it's can fit into our quality programs or our regulatory programs and our gender equity reports that we have to do. It seems to me that it needs to be interventions that are intermixed between two things, both our values that our cultures and our behaviors show, but also the policies and the regulatory aspects and the strategies and processes that we set up. How do you see that, and how do you see that being successful as we move forward in setting up interventions for the process we use for this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. These issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion and wellness are so intimately intertwined, and they do require very careful systems level interventions. And so that is why I feel that we're so fortunate to be in healthcare, because we know how to do this. We have models for healthcare quality improvement, and we can take those frameworks and apply them to our systems and look at what the structures are that are leading to the challenges that we're seeing, and address those structures, address the processes. And again, it's that plan, do, study, act cycle, right? You implement a change and then you measure and you see what happens. So, you come up with your metrics. What are going to be your outcomes measures, and you're going to follow them. And you'll have some that'll be process measures that you're looking at, and there'll be some actually hard outcomes. So you might look at whether 100% of a committee went through an unconscious bias training before they launched a search for a position, or you'll look at how many most institutions will do formal searches and have formal criteria for at least their most senior positions, but how many mid-level positions were actually advertised and with formal criteria and approached in the right way. And you could measure those processes, and then you can also look at, of course, the outcomes of how many of the searches ended up having at least one woman or minority, the Rooney Rule, in the final shortlist, and how many of the searches actually ended up hiring a woman or someone from an underrepresented group. So that is, I think, the way that we might approach it.
What do you think of the issues or the problems that we have when we don't have enough gender equity sitting at tables making decisions or in senior leadership types of roles? What do you think are the downstream effects that are most prominent that we can think may be harmful for a healthcare organization?
Yeah, I remember being asked really early on if I thought it was important, where it was a leading question where they thought my answer was going to be yeah, but my answer wasn't yeah. And it was, do you want more women in leadership because women's health is so undervalued and underappreciated? And the answer was only partly yeah, because yes, I do think that having greater diversity in leadership will lead us to recognize that, for example, in that PNAS study I showed up front, that, why do we call it atypical chest pain? Why do we call it atypical chest pain when it's the type of chest pain that women typically present with when they have a heart attack? 50% of our population typically presents with this kind of chest pain, but we call it atypical chest pain because it's not men's typical chest pain. Drives me crazy. That kind of thing, yes, I think is very important, and having women at the table helps to call attention to that. But the point is that this is about improving human health. Period. Human health, not women's health. This is about improving human health. We are engaged in the activity of promoting human health, and we're going to have better outcomes if we have diverse minds working on these problems.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to read a couple of the questions that have come in through the chat line. One person says, are you talking to the medical boards, or are the surgical boards involved in the discussion of maternity and paternity leave? And does your work also promote paternity leave?
Yes, it does. So I did try to say parental leave when I was talking about the policy. So it is, I said maternity leave, I think, when I talked about my own, but parental leave is what I think is very important. And the reason I think that parental leave is so important is because we have created the expectation that women are the expert parents. So my favorite story along these lines is going to the Ann Arbor Racquet Club. So I live in a small college town, and we have a tennis club that most faculty belong to, and their kids swim in the swimming pool, and we were in the locker room, and it's a small community and everybody knows everybody. And so my daughter looks up at me and she sees a sign on the wall of the women's locker room, and it says, boys under the age of 4 are allowed in here. And she looked at me and she shrugged her shoulders. She must have been maybe 7 at the time. What's up with that? And I said, oh, honey, some people think that because women physically bear children, that they're better at taking care of children. And, it turns out, and she then followed that up with, and I said, but don't worry, she's like, that's not going to happen. And I said, oh yeah, no, it won't. Just marry a person like dad who will do half the work. And she looked at me and said, within earshot of everyone in that locker room, oh no, mom, dad does way more than half the work. But what actually the reason that dad does way more than half the work is he is the expert parent in our family. And do you know how he became the expert parent in our family? I am the only person who's ever going to say that HELP syndrome is a good thing. Because when I got pre-eclamptic and was on a mag drip and we had our baby come early and, didn't know what we were doing as parents, he had to step up. I mean, somebody had to take a parenting class. I remember they're coming to my bedside and saying, we feel really bad for you. We see that you had your parenting, like how to diaper the baby thing. And I was not a babysitter type when I was young. I had no clue. Only babies I had ever diapered were in my pediatrics rotation, where like mothers would take the child away from me and be like, it's okay, honey, I could do this probably better than you. I was going to learn that, but I booked it for 3 weeks before the baby was due. It's like when you were supposed to book it. I followed the rules. And they said, well, we have a class here in the hospital for parents who were surprised by an early delivery. There I am, like hallucinating. I'm like, it's so hot. Can I have water? It's so hot. Please. I'm so parched. I mean, like I'm on a mag drip. I'm not doing well. My husband's like, why don't I go for that? So he went and he learned and he became the expert parent. And when we give maternity leaves and we give women the time off after they've recovered from that medical leave, then there just needs to be a parental leave. It needs to be a medical leave to recover from whatever physical trauma you've had from childbirth and the initial period of lactation. And then all people are parents. Otherwise, we're going to create reinforcing systems of expert parents who happen to be the women who bore the children.
Right. Thank you. There's another question here that says, thank you so much for your talk. As a female, all of this resonates with me on a deep and personal level. My question to you is, how do we promote and disseminate this information to our male colleagues who may not perceive these as being issues that really exist in our workplace?
Yeah, so I think this is really important is we can disseminate this in a way that calls people's attention to the importance, because when we say to people, I'm concerned about this because this affects the ends that we're pursuing together. And did you know that there's literature that shows that diverse teams actually do a better job? Like, there's a science paper about collective intelligence. Like if you found a factor that correlated with collective intelligence, any other factor, everyone, and it was published in Science, everyone would know this paper. Woolley et al. I recommend it to you. There is a benefit to diversity. And so engaging with your colleagues by saying, I think this will help us do what we're trying to do together better. And then owning the ways that you've screwed up. I mean, every time I hear someone own the way that they've messed something up so that the other person doesn't feel like they did something wrong, that they're being accused of being unfair, especially intentionally unfair. A lot of this behavior is unconscious, it's socialized, it's internalized, it is not intentional. And so to just say like, look, we all act this way and we all suffer as a result. And so how can we fix this? I think that works.
Yes. I think that we are at 5:59 and we are going to close out this session. We do have a small group of a leadership group that's going to meet at 6 o'clock. So we want to make sure that we give you enough time to get to that. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And again, this is being recorded so that we can watch it with the people in the internal medicine group or other folks that would like to tomorrow. And just really thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts. We are really feel very honored to have had you here this evening. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.
You will, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for leading this initiative.
Absolutely.